morning. Welcome to the 83rd Landon Lecture on Public Issues. It is a distinct privilege and honor for us at Kansas State University this morning to have as our speaker General Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Before I introduce General Powell, let me introduce to you the other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. James Kelleher, Professor of Civil Engineering and President of the Faculty Senate at K-State. Next to him, we do not have a standing member of Fort Riley, but a senior in business administration and president of the student body at Kansas State, Lauren Cuffey. On my right, Dr. Charles Reagan, chairman of the Landon Lecture Series and my executive assistant. I regret that Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury, was unable to be here with us this morning due to the untimely death of his mother. General Powell was born in 1937 in the South Bronx, New York. He earned a bachelor's degree in geology from the City University of New York, and later a master's in business administration from George Washington University. In 1958, he was commissioned as second lieutenant in the regular Army through the Reserve Officer Training Corps. After finishing infantry officers' basic training in airborne and ranger schools, he was assigned to Germany. General Powell went to Vietnam in late 1962 and served as an advisor to a Vietnamese infantry battalion. In 1973, he assumed the command of the 1st Battalion in Korea. In 1977, General Powell returned to Washington to serve in the Intermediate Office of the Secretary of Defense. In 1983, he was appointed as Senior Military Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberg. In 1986, he assumed the command of the 5th Corps in Frankfurt, Germany. He has a long list of awards and decorations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Soldier's Medal, the Bronze Star, the Air Medal, the Purple Heart. He has also received the President's Citizens Medal, the Secretary of State Distinguished Service Medal, and the Secretary of Energy Distinguished Service Medal. General Powell has served as a National Security Advisor to President Reagan, the Commander-in-Chief of Forces Command under President Bush. And in August of 1989, General Powell was appointed by President Bush as the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This means that General Powell is the highest ranking military officer in the United States of America. Please join me in welcoming General Powell to Kansas State and the Landon platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that very, very kind introduction. And let me say to all of you up there that I can't really see how very glad I am to be here this morning. It's always a pleasure to be back in Kansas. In my last job, I had the opportunity to visit Fort Riley not too long ago. On that occasion, seeing those great soldiers out at Fort Riley, I had my spirits rejuvenated, and now I'm back for more. I was also stationed at Fort Leavenworth twice in the course of my career, so I feel like a native Kansan. In Kansas, I feel close to the heart of America. I've told many foreign leaders, to include recently Marshal Akhrameyev, who until about a year ago was head of the Soviet Armed Forces, that they really wouldn't know America you really wouldn't know what we're all about until they had driven across Kansas and seen the great sweep of the plains and the vastness of the fields and met kind of people who really and truly are the soul of America. I wanted them to gain an appreciation for the spirit of our pioneers, of the men and women who opened up this great Midwest, who came up the Missouri River and spread like so much rich loam across the territory, causing towns to spring up, railroads and forts to be built, buffalo soldiers to ride across the prairies, and crops to rise in the field and the river bottoms. I wanted them to see where America's values had been tempered and strengthened in the hot cauldron of the summer's sun-drenched fields and in the freezing night of the deep winter's chill. I wanted them to see and understand the tremendous potential and promise of this bounteous land. In this land without horizon, one sees the greatness and the goodness that is America. Kansas was bought from a war-loving empire by a peace-loving president in a deal known to history as the Louisiana Purchase. Caught up in the demands of war, Napoleon needed money desperately, and the young American Republic had the money to give him. Thomas Jefferson had a vision about these territories, that they would fit naturally into the vigorous but still young nation and make a magnificent contribution at some later date. Today around us, we see the brilliance of that great man's vision. Kansas is the real America. Even for an Eastern New York Yankee such as I am, to come to Kansas always refreshes the soul. So, ladies and gentlemen, students, I'm glad to be here with you today, and I'm honored to speak to this prestigious forum known as the Landon Lecture. Let me begin by thanking you all for the splendid support you give to our armed forces here in Kansas. The history of Kansas and the armed forces of the United States are closely entwined. Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, McConnell Air Force Base, they all flourish because of your commitment to a strong defense. Our military men and women couldn't ask for better community support. For example, I know how much the Fort Riley folks appreciate the fine relationship that you've established with them. The Kansas State Fort Riley Day celebration held just over a month ago is symbolic of that outstanding relationship. In fact, the only kind of complaint I hear from our military folks out here has to do with a small group of sailors working throughout Kansas to prepare and train reservists and to recruit for the sea service. It's a little tough to do here when you don't have a training aid called an ocean to show prospective recruits, but they do a great job too. Now this morning I want to talk to you about the future. For many years, some very bright people have been speculating about the future from this podium. Opening the forum in 1966, Governor Landon spoke about new challenges in international relations, still a very relevant subject today. 10 years later, again at this forum, Senator Henry M. Jackson spoke about America and freedom's future. And if he were alive today, he would be amazed and enthused at what's happening around the world. And then slightly more than a decade later, my good friend, Senator Nancy Landon Cassabaum, delivered a lecture here entitled The Challenge of Change. Today, 2 years later, the senator should feel satisfied with her prescience. Her lecture title fits perfectly the events of the current situation in the world. And I want to continue in that tradition. I want to talk about the historic turning point we are at now as we look to the future. That greatest of all American philosophers, Yogi Berra, once said something that accurately describes, believe it or not, the turning point. He said, the future just ain't what it used to be. Yogi has a way with words that cuts right through to the heart of the matter. The future is jam-packed with opportunities and challenges that we already know about, and many more coming our way that we are just beginning to sense, but can't yet quite visualize. Space exploration, the depletion of fossil fuels, the disposition of our nuclear waste, the protection of our precious environment, the education of our youth, the elimination of drug abuse, the preservation of the family as the basic building block of society, the application of new technologies that will outstrip the wonders of what we've seen so far by orders of magnitude, and the flowering of freedom. There have been few times in humanity's lifespan that have offered so much excitement, such accelerated change, such dramatic promise as the time in which we are living. Indeed, as Yogi said, the future ain't what it used to be. And nowhere is the future more exciting than on the international scene as we watch the historic and wrenching changes in the nation that has been our chief adversary for over 40 years, the Soviet Union. In Europe last week, Secretary Cheney, my boss, described this situation as phenomenal and as giving us cause for great optimism. These changes in the Soviet Union mark the beginning of a historic transition period that hopefully may lead to a fundamental, permanent transformation. We know that President Gorbachev is not Thomas Jefferson meditating over a Declaration of Independence. He is not overthrowing a government. He's not ready to dismember the Soviet Empire, nor should we expect him to. Yet, he has set loose forces, feelings, and created expectations that will be difficult to control and hard to reverse. He's let the genie out of the bottle, and I don't believe it will return. And when the genie came out, it flew by Eastern Europe, and dramatic changes are occurring. We see a non-communist government elected in Poland. We see the Communist Party abolished and a republic declared in Hungary, and the hammer and sickle symbolically burned from the Hungarian flag. We see stirrings in East Germany, cries for freedom in the Baltic, and rumblings in the Ukraine. We see riot police with clubs in hand trying to keep this movement from sweeping through the streets of Prague and Czechoslovakia. And the reason for all this change, the reason we're seeing this, is that the Soviets have failed. Their system is in disarray, and they search for new answers. I believe it's prudent that we ask ourselves this morning why they failed. I believe there are several reasons. Foremost among them is communist ideology. It is on its deathbed. An ideology without new recruits will die. The ideology attracts no one any longer, except economic and political failures such as Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. The system structured since 1917 to embody this ideology imposes severe limits on human energy. In fact, limits on human initiative are fundamental to the functioning of that system. Human creativity is curtailed. Human inventiveness and free spirit are replaced with an enforced stupor, a resigned obedience to the party, and the denial of the basic human rights we take for granted. Similarly, the economic pillar in their system has failed badly. It matches the wits of an entrenched bureaucracy against the tens of thousands of daily decisions and twists and turns of a world market that defies such a centralized system of management. It produces an inevitable inertia for that bureaucracy and long, dismal lines for millions of citizens. It produces thousands of tanks, but store shelves that are empty of butter and sugar. It produces hundreds of the most modern nuclear missiles, but 10-year-long waiting lists for apartments. And then when the Soviet system also set about building a world empire, it squandered enormous sums of money with little to show for the investment. Here, not only were rubles wasted, enormous goodwill was dissipated, and the world was made fearful by Soviet expansionism. And now, few nations around the world look to the Soviet Union for any political inspiration or for international security. The communist system sought to suppress human thought in an increasingly open world. In an age where the power of the mass media and even CNN can penetrate the very walls of the Kremlin, where information seeps between prison bars, and where the ever-present journalist can no longer be totally denied, the Soviets sought, against all odds, to reinforce their artificial barriers, their walls, and their disinformation machine. And what they have discovered is that it didn't work. The Soviets have given us recent and pervasive examples of the results of that kind of oppression. Today, that system is showing us once again that change can and will be broken. The human body can be oppressed, but the human spirit cannot be denied. The oppressed will always revolt. The only question is when and where, and what set of circumstances will allow the spirit to smell freedom again. These elemental forces are wrenching apart the Soviet Empire. An ideology with no answers for today's questions, an economy with no goods, a foreign policy with no security, and the rising expectations of the Soviet people all combined to produce President Gorbachev, just like rain and sun and hard work produce a field of corn. And without these tremendous internal forces, we wouldn't have a Gorbachev. He and other Soviet leaders understand, in my view, the nature of these forces and the need for dramatic change if they are to preside over a superpower worthy of the name as we approach the 21st century. The Soviet Union cannot easily retrace the steps it is now taking. Lenin's one step forward, two steps back has become as many steps forward as possible and try not to look back. We don't know what's possible. It is not yet clear how far the Soviets can go. Now, I'm not here to be either a Cold War warrior or to declare the Cold War over. These and similar shorthand terms no longer reflect the complex relationship that exists between the superpowers, between the West and the East. We are not going to eliminate or expunge superpower competition from the world. We must also understand that. But it's important to recall where the Soviets were just a few years ago, how far they have come, as witnessed by the cascade of changes we see in our news every day, and also how much further they still have to go. It is also important to ask ourselves another question. In all this seething change, why are we the ones who appear to be winning? Why is it that our system appears to be prevailing? I believe that foremost among the reasons for our success is our system of values, the free world's values of freedom, human rights, democratic government, free market economies, and the rule of law have stood in stark counterpoint to dying communist ideology. In the West, we have proven for all the world to see that people can work together to guarantee political liberty, economic prosperity, and human rights. Our Western values are the values the rest of the world is yearning for. In Leipzig and East Berlin, where over 500,000 East Germans demonstrated a few years ago, the demands they shouted to their national leaders sound very familiar right here in Kansas. The right to have free elections, as we did yesterday around the country, the right to form opposition political parties, the right to assemble freely, and the democratic right to participate in the navigation, the upkeep, and the servicing of the political process. One of the speakers in Berlin earlier this week said, "We have regained our voice." The difference in Kansas and all across the great land of America is that these are our inalienable rights, not something to be regained. These are our birthrights. Glasnost was given to us by our creators. It was not authorized by a ruling elite, however newly enlightened. For us, the human spirit is unchecked, except by the constraints of law, freely agreed to in a democratic process. Our political philosophy is sound and needs neither resurrection nor restructuring. No political perestroika is necessary for us. Government of, by, and for the people is its own renewal. Built into the political process is a constant refurbishment and almost daily house cleaning. Some people in the world mistake our house cleaning, our sometimes noisy, contentious democratic process, for weakness and disharmony. But it's not that at all. That noise you hear is democracy at work. And our democracy is like a life raft. It's always got water in it, and your feet are always wet, but it never sinks. It absolutely refuses to sink. And once you couple this powerful political process with an economic system of free trade, private enterprise, and entrepreneurial spirit, the horizons are limitless. Moreover, our friends and allies around the world are the Fortune 500 of the economic community and of the international world. When you put England, France, West Germany, Japan, Canada, Korea, and all the rest of our friends and allies up against the Vietnams, North Koreas, and Cubas of the world, you begin to see what I mean. You also begin to see what has caused the Soviets to recognize their failure. Can you imagine what it must feel like to be ever mindful of the fact that Japan is off your east coast and West Germany near your western border? If you are a Soviet leader, while you stare transfixed at two of the most vibrant economic miracles in the world that rose from the ashes of World War II, you can't explain why there are no potatoes in Vladivostok nor any soap in the Ukraine. Our strong alliances presented the Soviets with an impenetrable barrier to their dream of foreign empire, and at the same time gave them an incredible example of what they were missing. Is it any wonder that they finally saw the light? I think not. The wonder is that it took so long. And maybe there's a reason hidden in that wonder, because the Soviets seem finally to have come to their new thinking after years of witnessing not only the tremendous cohesiveness of the free world's alliances and the power of our economies, but also the determined will of our people. A will demonstrated by our dedication to the rebuilding of our defenses, by our fundamental commitment to the bedrock of our national security, our military might and its deterrent effect. No matter how sound your system, how powerful your politics, how dynamic your economy, how strong your values, without the armed forces to back them up, a democratic nation can still be at risk. America's resurgent military strength sent a powerful signal to the Soviets, a signal that we would match them step by step, that when it came to armed might, no one would be allowed ever to threaten America or its alliances. And it is the rebuilding of our military strength over the past 10 years that helped bring the Soviets to the point where they are today, just as surely as did all the other elements of our national power. So with communism dying and the Soviets grasping for ways to revive it, and with our systemic strength restored, what do? Do we engage? Do we sit back and watch? Do we focus on helping Eastern Europe? Do we stay strong in our military? What do? We do what our president has suggested. We engage. We give due credit to the Soviets for what they have done, and we encourage them to do more for themselves, for us, for the benefit of all mankind. We acknowledge what we see happening in the Soviet Empire, and we seek ways to work with the Soviets to go beyond containment. I believe one of the most fundamental aspects of our approach to the future should be a resolute determination to reshape history and to work for a permanent peace, to work with our friends and allies, and work with our still potential adversaries. The period ahead is uncertain, unstable, and we are understandably anxious about the future. But we should not be afraid. We are the people in the world who are winning. We are the ones whose spirits should be soaring. We are the ones who cause this movement that you see around the world, this movement toward peace, toward freedom, toward democracy. We must take mutual advantage of every opportunity that presents itself. We must engage the Soviets at every point where our mutual interests are advanced. We must open the way for them to enter the world community. We must guide them down an irreversible road with international agreements, openness with exposure to basic values, arms reduction, and ultimately irreversible entry into the inextricably binding world community. But reality for the Soviets, and market forces must be acknowledged and at work in the Soviet economy. The Soviets must make unilateral defense cuts as well as mutual cuts that result from signed agreements. They're the ones with the massive military machine out of all proportion to legitimate defense needs. They could cut unilaterally for years before we arrived at even rough parity in numbers. And as we do execute arms control agreements, we must remember that trust but verified has lost none of its meaning in the days since Mr. Gorbachev's magic became so spellbinding around the world. We must remember how we got to this historic turning point in history. Our systemic strength and the strength of our allies has gotten us here. And a crucial dimension of that strength is our well-trained, proud, and ready military force. In a system of strong and robust alliances that spans horizons from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we must provide the leadership. Without us, there can be no substantive movement toward a permanent peace. With us, the free world writes its own destiny. We can't afford to be infatuated by what we see. We're beyond containment, but we're not beyond danger. Not with the Soviets still devoting 15 to 17% of their gross national product to their military, and not while they are continuing to make and modernize strategic systems that can destroy the United States in 30 minutes. We should go with caution into the sunlight that the Soviets have found so devastatingly bright. We're accustomed to this kind of sunlight. They've never seen it before in their history. And while they attempt to regain a perspective, to put together an effective economic structure, and to repair their floundering bureaucracy, we must pay heed to all the elements of our systemic strength, including our armed forces. Our resources are scarce, and there are many demands on them. But we must have, for example, strategic forces, and they must be modern so that we can deal from a position of strength and sufficiency. B-1 and B-2 bombers, Trident submarines, MX and Midgetman and D-5 missiles are very, very expensive systems. But they will sustain us for decades, and they will ensure that we are never at a disadvantage. And these strategic forces and their upkeep are critical if we want to achieve a sound and verifiable strategic arms agreement, and if we want to keep the peace afterwards. We must have conventional forces that remain strong, ready, and proud, even if they have to be smaller due to conventional force agreements or because of constrained dollars. We need an army with forward deployed units in critical regions and home-based strategically deployable units ready for any contingency in the world that threatens our interest. We need a Navy whose maritime presence around the world is unmistakable to friend and adversary alike, and a Marine Corps that's ready for any call. We need an Air Force that can clear the skies the moment such a task is called for. In short, we must continue to protect ourselves while at the same time taking advantage of all the opportunities open to us by the historic changes we are seeing in the world. We must not allow ourselves to be confused about our security. In that respect, the future has not changed. The world is still dangerous, still possessed of threats to our republic, and still demanding of ready armed forces to deter war and, God forbid if necessary, to win at war if that is what is ordained. The Soviets have come far. I give President Gorbachev credit. I have met with him 5 times. I know he is moving in directions that should bring stability and greater peace to the world. we too have come far, and I must give credit to the American people and to all the free peoples of the world who have been with us in this effort. In our analysis of current events, we must remember where the Soviets were. We must keep in mind where they've come from. We must remember that it was not long ago that they were invading Afghanistan, fully supportive of Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, and they were airlifting Cubans to Angola. And we must remember where we were, hungover from the traumatic experience of the Vietnam conflict, and on the verge of dismantling our military establishment through a sustained form of benign neglect. Now, after we've rediscovered our position of leadership in the free world and rebuilt our armed forces into the best we've ever had in time of peace, we find a happy coincidence. The Soviets have discovered their system is a failure and want to change. But we know it's more than a happy coincidence. It's a world of new opportunities that we help produce. And to push the opportunities to the maximum extent possible, we must maintain America's systemic strength, a strength we have rebuilt in all of its dimensions over the past decade, political, economic, and military. And we must keep trained, ready, and proud the men and women who make up that vital dimension of our systemic strength, the armed forces of the United States. You might ask, how can people standing in democracy's life raft with wet feet, personal problems, car payments to make, tuition bills to pay, families to nurture, parents to worry about, and for many in this room, exams to worry about beginning on the 18th of December, how can people like us contribute? How can we make a difference? I want to tell you that not only can we contribute, I want to tell you, I must tell you, that we are the crew as well as the passengers in the life raft I call democracy. You are the very essence of what I'm referring to, the essence of the American dream. You are what makes Kansas, Kansas, and America, for all the world to see. Without you, there would be no dream. And the future I speak of, with all of its excitement and hope, will continue to demand the sacrifice of Americans such as you who love your country and are willing to serve your country in one form or another. There is a grave marker in Arlington National Cemetery that has a very special meaning for me. The marker has just a last name on it, Murphy. And beneath the name Murphy are engraved these words: Patriot, an honest man who served his country for 42 years, Corporal, United States Marine Corps, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Staff Director, U.S. House of Representatives. This man had given at least half, and perhaps as much as 2/3 of his life to serving his country in one way or another. He had been born, grown to manhood, been educated, and then spent the rest of his life in the service of his country. And as I looked on that humble, simple gravesite, I thought, what more can a man or a woman have said about them that matters? The man was honest. He was a patriot. He served his nation for almost half a century. I can think of no finer epitaph. Thomas Jefferson proclaimed that the strength of America lay in her people who are free to think, to speak, to act, and to serve as their conscience and their law dictates. And he knew full well that the strength of America's government lay in the quality of those who chose to serve her in whatever capacity. I want to express my gratitude to all of you in this audience who have rendered public service. You've laid up treasure in heaven. For example, I commend those of you involved in the Kansas Margin of Excellence program, now in its 3rd year. Your service is of the most invaluable kind. As President Bush has said on a number of occasions, it's at the local level that the problems of education are best solved, and with this program, you've taken that guidance to heart and done something about it. There's an old adage that fits our situation and frame of reference perfectly. Children, the saying goes, don't inherit the future world from their parents. Parents borrow the future world from their children. Kansas is taking care of that very, very precious loan. I also want to challenge each of the young people in this audience. I firmly believe that to serve America in these challenging and rapidly changing times promises to be the most exciting and rewarding adventure in the journal of history. And we shouldn't ask for glory for what we've done or what we were about to do. We should find that our service is its own rewards. So become good parents, make a good family, serve on the town council, fight for the environment, fight drugs, produce the best foreign products, vote in every election, be interested in politics. And if it should happen that you think about entering one of our armed services, I request that you recall what I've said here today. In that essential and crucial dimension of America's systemic strength, you will be a most vital part. You are America's future. And that future really ain't what it used to be, but America is. America still holds out the torch to all who will be enlightened by its glow. America still beckons to the world's oppressed, to the teeming millions who yearn to be free, to throw off the chains that bind them. So long as her values are upheld, America won't change. So long as her men and women still seek to grasp every opportunity to make the world a better place, America won't fail. So long as we are constantly in a process of renewal and rededication, there is no human limit to the world we can create, to the peace and prosperity we can enjoy. So long as in Kansas, in Maine, California, and Texas, and in all of this great land, Americans are Americans, and we remain true to our values and principles, then people around the world will follow our example and cast off the chains of oppression, even ultimately into the darkest corners of the earth. Thank you very much.
General, thank you very much. What an excellent, moving address. We've all heard the expression that the American military is in good hands. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen this morning exactly why that saying is true. Let's give another big hand to the General. We're going to ask the General to answer a few of your questions here this morning. We do have several distinguished guests with us here today. I would like to introduce to you the Commanding General of Fort Riley, General Thomas Ray. General? And the Commanding General of the Kansas National Guard, General Phil Finley. And the civilian aide for the United States Army, Fred Bramlett. Fred, God bless you. Well, we're delighted to have so many of our students, faculty, and staff here this morning, and we're so honored to have our military friends from Fort Riley and from other bases throughout the state and the nation. We're delighted to have you here. So I think now this would be an appropriate time to find out if we have any people who would like to ask some questions. It isn't every day of the week that we have the Joint Chiefs chair here at Kansas State. So if you have some questions, just move to your left or to your right. There are microphones on either side. Okay? Here we have one right here. John?
General, when the national deficit is in the trillions of dollars, when this country can't even pay the interest on this debt, when military spending contributes a large amount of this to the deficit, and further, with Fort Riley's specific mission to defend our allies against the Soviet Union, which in your own words, in disarray, How can you justify actions such as the proposed Fort Riley land acquisition, which would remove millions of dollars of property from tax rolls and agricultural production, and displace citizens, as you said at the beginning of your remarks, from the heart and of the soul of the real American? What of our dreams of peace, promise, and the future?
Through?
Yes. Thank you.
I'd like to answer piece by piece. We do have a serious deficit problem, I acknowledge that. But one of the principal responsibilities the government has to its people is to provide for its security. And that's what your United States Armed Forces do. And we take about 28% of the total federal budget to perform that function, and we have done it very well and will continue to do it well. But if you want United States Armed Forces that are trained, ready, and proud, and are able to do a mission for our interests, not just the interest of our European allies, it's in our interest to have that kind of a force. It's that kind of a force that brought the Soviets right to where they are now. If you want that kind of force, you've got to be prepared to make the investment. You've got to be prepared to give them the wherewithal they need to be ready if called on. I don't ever want to preside over a military force that is not ready to do what it's called upon to do when the lives of men and women are at stake. Now that requires training. It requires the best equipment we can possibly give our soldiers. Now I recognize that at the same time there are competing interests in situations such as the Fort Riley land acquisition. The 1st Infantry Division, the great 1st Infantry Division at Riley, has been made a more modern force with the kinds of systems we're putting into it and with the ranges we have added to the post, and they need more maneuver room. But at the same time, I recognize that there are competing interests. And so what we are doing is completing our land use study, which was finished last month, and we are now going through the necessary process to see whether or not this truly is in the best interest of the entire community. I know what I'd like to do if I had a free reign, and what I know that Fort Riley needs. That is a demonstrated need. But at the same time, we recognize we have to be good members of this community. And so we'll go through a very, very extended, careful, analytical process to make sure that we are doing what is best for the total community around Fort Riley. And I can assure you that it will be a process that will stand all kinds of scrutiny. I will say to you that we got where we are because we were prepared to make the investment necessary in our armed forces, and we shouldn't lose that. If there's one thing I know the Soviets have been able to count on in recent years, that the Americans were going to remain strong. I've sat in 5 summit meetings over the last 2 years telling them that, being able to demonstrate it, being able to look behind my shoulder and seeing the American people solidly committed, seeing the Fort Rileys and the big red ones of the Army ready to serve our national interest if necessary. But at the same time, I hope a day will come when we won't have to make this kind of investment. We're all working for that. But until that day comes, guys, keep your powder dry and get ready.
Sir, I want to ask you, what do you think, what's your opinion of Mr. Ortega's cancellation of the ceasefire with the Contras, and what role do you perceive the United States or the military playing in restoring democracy to Nicaragua?
I think it's very unfortunate that he canceled the ceasefire, although there's some suggestion he may be reinstituting it within the next few days. But it's typical of his approach to business all along. I think his real objective is to forestall the elections that are now scheduled, because he knows full well that if there were free and fair elections in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government under his leadership would not win. So I think that all he is doing right now is trying to confuse the situation so that he can interfere with the electoral process. At this point, I do not see any requirement for the United States Armed Forces to become involved in any way. And as the President has indicated, it is not clear that there is any need for requesting additional military assistance for the freedom fighters, but the President has reserved his option to do that should he believe the situation has changed dramatically. What Mr. Ortega is after is to keep the Sandinista regime in power for as long as possible, trying to deny the people of Nicaragua the opportunity for a free and fair vote.
You seem to enjoy Washington. I'm curious, would you like to be the first chairman and minority member to achieve the Oval Office? And if so, do you feel the American people will elect a military man?
I am a simple soldier, and I do the job I'm in under the philosophy that sufficient unto the day is the evil therein, and I let somebody else worry about the future. I have no political ambitions. Make sure you don't walk out with the wrong impression.
Good morning, General. I have a two-part unrelated, two questions that are unrelated. One is, what was your role in the failed Panama coup? And two, what influence, if any, did Dwight Eisenhower have on your career?
I didn't get the second one. I got the first one.
What influence Dwight Eisenhower may have had on your career?
With respect to the coup events on the early October period, that Tuesday morning, I was in direct conflict with our direct contact with our commander on the ground, General Thurman, and was receiving information as events unfolded. Was able to provide information rapidly and directly into the National Command Authority, the Secretary of Defense, and the President. The President had enough information throughout that period that was coming from our commander down there through me to him to make very wise and informed choices, which he did. People have been somewhat critical of our actions in that morning, but I can tell you the President very carefully measures the use of the United States Armed Forces, and in that instance, he did not see enough in the situation to believe that it warranted any commitment of the United States Armed Forces, and I believe his judgment was absolutely correct, and it was the recommendation that I provided to him as well as the recommendation that had been provided by our commander on the scene. Oh, Eisenhower. You wrapped up one of these questions, you forget the next one. Very great influence. I've read a number of his works. I have been impressed by his ability not only as a wartime commander, but in that wartime period to serve as a very effective diplomat in putting together and sustaining one of the great coalitions of history. And then to see his contributions in time of peace subsequently has been a source of inspiration. He also was quite a human general, and a saying that I can't quote exactly, but I always have it in my desk drawer, essentially said, listen to your soldiers, listen to what those who work for you are saying, and you will be a very, very wise man. And he kind of lived that philosophy throughout all of his public life, and I've tried to emulate a little bit of him. I think he was a great man. This is the fun part.
In your remarks, you said that superpower competition will not cease. I'd be interested in what do you see as the basic nature of that competition going to be, and how will it be different from what we've experienced in the past?
Increasingly, I think it'll be an economic competition of political systems. What I've noticed in recent years, and particularly in the last 2 years when I worked at the National Security Council, is a certain weariness with respect to regional conflicts producing results, these various wars that have been going on. And as a result of that war weariness and the more forthcoming attitude of the Soviet Union, we've been able to resolve a few of those in Southern Africa, in Angola, in Cambodia. We have a ceasefire in the Persian Gulf between Iran and Iraq. This is not to say we are without troubles around the world, but there's a certain war weariness. And the Soviets have clearly said that the investment they have been putting into their military has not produced results that are terribly useful for their world standing or for their internal economic problems. So I see the competition shifting from military competition to political competition, a competition for ideas, which I think they will lose, and I think they've just about acknowledged that as they try to shift through their own ideology to see what is salvageable. Economic, political, the competition of ideas, the competition of values. But when all is said and done, the Soviet Union will have a formidable armed force. Mr. Gorbachev has said that. This isn't Colin Powell saying it. Mr. Gorbachev has said it. Marshal Akhamayev has said it. And General Yazev has said it. We should take them at their word. They will make whatever investment is necessary in their armed forces to preserve what they believe to be their interest.
General, what are your feelings about using active duty military in the war against drugs?
I'm for it. Consistent with our law and tradition, I think there's a lot that the armed forces can do to fight this war. It is a war. The President said so, the American people have said so, and the purpose of the armed forces is also to help preserve domestic tranquility and take on enemies, foreign and domestic. This is a domestic enemy. I think we have a role to play. But at the same time, I don't think it's consistent with our philosophy and tradition and law for the armed forces to serve as policemen, to go out to arrest or apprehend. But we have capabilities in our intelligence units, in our cavalry units, in our aviation units, in a variety of our other functional areas that we can apply to the war on drugs. We can do a better job in using training activities along the southwest border to help watch the border and to thicken the presence of our Border Patrol Service. We have systems that could be useful to law enforcement activities. And so we're going to take a far more aggressive role than we have in the past. And in fact, just last night, I sat down with Secretary Cheney and gave him an update on the various things that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and our various commanders are working on in order to do just that. And we'll be making some very specific proposals to the President in the very near future. Okay? So we out of time? Yeah.